Pessoal, sejam todos muito bem, quer dizer, eu não sou o anfitrião, mas todos muito bem-vindos em nome de quem está nos recebendo e obrigado pelo convite. Eu vou fazer uma apresentação do professor e logo passo a palavra a ele. Então, nessa apresentação eu gostaria apenas de salientar alguns aspectos da vida dele, da história, da formação, da trajetória dele, para que vocês entendam um pouco quem que vocês estão ouvindo hoje, né? Então ele nasceu numa família de pânditas, num vilarejo no Nepal, uma família que há muitos séculos conduzia as escolas de ensinamento tradicionais, os gurukulams, né? Dentro de uma linhagem Shaiva. E ainda aos 4 anos de idade o pai dele começou a ensinar sânscrito para ele. Aos 6 começou a ensinar os Vedas, aos 10 ele já sabia todo o Yajurveda de cor, né? Então aquele treinamento de Brahmins, né, clássicos. Aos 12 o pai dele mandou ele embora, falou, não, você já aprendeu muito, você tem que aprender mais, e né, eles caminharam 8 horas até o ponto de ônibus mais próximo, que foi a primeira vez que ele viu veículos sob rodas e eletricidade, e ele foi parar em Katmandu aos 12 anos de idade, e foi buscar professores para continuar a educação dele ali. E ele passou dos 16 até meados dos 30 anos de vida dele, aprendendo com uma série de professores diferentes no Nepal, em Katmandu, em Varanasi, na Índia, professores nepaleses, indianos, caxemires, que ensinaram para ele todas as tradições de pensamento indianas. Então, dentro daquele modo tradicional de aprendizagem, então, por exemplo, quando ele foi estudar Nyaya, a escola especializada na lógica clássica indiana, ele memorizou o Tattva Chintamani do Gangesha Upadhyaya, o fundador do Navya Nyaya, e estudou a fundo com um dos melhores professores dessa escola. E quando ele foi estudar Vedanta também, ele estava dentro de uma linhagem que adivinha do autor dos 2 maiores e mais difíceis livros de filosofia vedantina do século XX, né, que era da Kashmira, Shankara Chaitanya Bharati. E assim por diante ele foi aprendendo uma série de traduções de pensamento diferentes, tudo em sânscrito já desde bem novo. E ele fez parte de um projeto nos anos 80 de conservação de manuscritos antigos no Nepal, porque quem não sabe, no Nepal nós temos a maior preservação de manuscritos antigos do mundo hindu, porque ali o clima é favorável à preservação de documentos, né? Ao contrário do restante ali do subcontinente, em que o calor costuma prejudicar, né, a sobrevivência dos textos. Então tem muitos manuscritos antigos e raros que só existem ali, né? Então os alemães estavam financiando na época um projeto de conservação de manuscritos, contrataram ele para poder ler os manuscritos antigos com caráteres meio apagados, que realmente demandavam uma pessoa com um domínio muito ímpar, né, da língua e do conteúdo, né, em si. Isso abriu algumas linhas de contato para ele que no futuro permitiram que, quando ele sentiu que ele teve que sair do Nepal, foi quando ocorreu a Revolução Maoísta ali, e uma certa hostilidade começou a ser dirigida a professores como ele, né, ele sofreu violência física, e então ele decidiu sair do Nepal com a sua família, e pelos seus contatos ele foi parar na Alemanha, onde ele fez o doutorado dele em filosofia indiana clássica. E depois disso acabou tendo a possibilidade de vir trabalhar no Ocidente como professor universitário. Então ele já passou por várias universidades diferentes nos Estados Unidos, e é um dos maiores scholars a respeito principalmente do pensamento, da cultura e da filosofia tântrica no mundo hoje. Não só por ter uma extensa formação tradicional nos textos, uma extensa formação tradicional no que tange às práticas, mas também uma formação acadêmica moderna, né, em inglês, que é uma combinação muito rara de se encontrar. Então, hoje o tema que ele vai discutir diz respeito à filosofia da mente, as questões sobre a consciência. Então, ele até elabora um debate com perspectivas contemporâneas a respeito, para então elaborar alguns princípios a partir do pensamento indiano no que diz respeito a esse tema. E ele conclui, né, toda a reflexão dele apontando os modos como essa perspectiva que ele vai apresentar é incorporada, desenvolvida pelos mestres das escolas de pensamento do Tantra, e como essa visão a respeito da consciência, da relação da consciência e do corpo, essa questão que tanto interessa a filosofia desde sempre, como isso informa o universo das práticas tântricas na tradição Shaiva Shakta. Então, com a palavra.
Thank you so much. I'm humbled to be in front of you, distinguished professors and friends. This is such an amazing opportunity to be here in this beautiful Brazil. I come from the Himalayan country of Nepal, and in this tropical place I find very much home with very warm people and a lot of fun and jokes. Talking on the issues of Indian philosophy, or let's say talk about any philosophy that is not thoroughly Anglo-Saxon, is already a marginal issue. Even the phenomenological studies is broadly a marginalized topic if you address the mainstream academia in the West, in Europe and America. And when we want to move beyond Europe and want to explore philosophies in Asia, most distinguished philosophers, if you go like Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, they also immediately reject any philosophy outside of Europe, and there they go pretty much doing etymology, or philosophy is pretty much just European. How can we expand the horizon of our knowledge if, as philosophers, we are not sincere to the truth and to the knowledge that no matter which stream it flows through? How can we not quench our thirst as philosophers for the pure water it comes from, no matter which well it belongs to, whether that particular well was dug by our own grandfathers or the people that were unknown to us? Particularly speaking, through the materials of the colonized cultures, brings yet another challenge. They are not written in English, and as we know, I'm speaking to non-English speaking audience, which is oxymoronic because I myself never got a single day of education in English language. Up till the age of 28, my medium of education was, and then also when I established my department in Nepal, the means of education was Sanskrit. And I realized that if I need to speak to the world, I need to learn the language of the world, and I had to accept one category to embrace myself, the colonizer's language, so that I could be speaking to the globe. And yes, there is a tremendous amount of wisdom in Indic traditions and some very good analytic philosophical materials, and my colleagues have done great work, like you can read Arindam Chakravarti, for example, or Stephen Phillips, to name another. And I have worked closely with both of these, and when we mention Gangesha and when we translate the materials in English, like Jonathan Gunnery, who has analyzed almost in mathematical logic, and we can communicate with the audience, the West. But the type of material I'm bringing in front of you today would be broadly laughed at. On one hand, I'm reading Mahabharata, a book of pure mythology, and Tantra, which is exotic material for sex and orgasm. So, how can we do philosophy not just from the marginalized culture, but also from the books that are already stereotyped and marginalized? And that is for all of us to rethink. And since the globe is changing, who could have imagined that I, as a Pandit, trained in Gurukula, would come not just to be a professor in America, but come in front of you and speak to this distinguished audience. This is just that we are getting closer and closer, and that we have the urgency to understand each other's, and we have to learn to take seriously the ideas for their validity. And they all deserve to be questioned, to be explored, and to be analyzed. Not that we have to take like some faith-based materials and take them on on face, but we all should be willing to open-heartedly read and analyze the materials, no matter where they come from and in which language they were originally written. And I deeply appreciate that you have given me this wonderful opportunity. Questions such as how does conscious experience emerge, or what presents phenomenality to consciousness, are not new. The objective of this paper is twofold. On one hand, the paper addresses a monistic metaphysics that seeks to ground an alternative to Cartesian dualism, and on the other hand, it explores an alternative model to reductionist materialism. In precise terms, the physicalism that boasts to be the dominant model of philosophical and scientific inquiry in our times. At the same time, we will exploit some arguments from Chalmers with regard to what he calls the hard problem. As David Chalmers argues, even when we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, perceptual discrimination, categorization, internal access, verbal report, there may still remain a further unanswered question: why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? I, however, do not follow the argument suggested on behalf of the binding problem, or consider that our subjectivity is an amalgamation of microsubjectivity in cellular structure. On the contrary, I read the arguments on behalf of cosmopsychism more closely and argue on behalf of emanation or abhivyakti as a process of differentiation. Meaning, the problem then is not that of emergence of higher order consciousness or of subjectivity, but of the emanation of the manifold. From the physicalist perspective, the brain, which in itself is in inertia, gives rise to consciousness as an emergent property by means of neuronic interaction, making consciousness inconceivable without the brain. Broadly relying on supervenance, wherein, for example, if some alteration in B is necessary for any alteration in M, B supervenes M, this model accepts that the emergent property of consciousness relies on the brain state as a foundational necessity. Some argue, however, that there is no supervenance but rather a causal relationship between conscious states and the brain. While there is no problem in a neural correlation with consciousness, the thesis that a diametric opposition between consciousness and inertia and the proposition that a radical difference between the properties of cause and effect exists, as Strawson argues, is a violation of the law of nature. Or as Goff argues, physicalism is unable to account for the reality of phenomenal consciousness. An alternative generally presented to this thesis is an argument following panpsychism. Panpsychists broadly argue that consciousness permeates all the basic structures of reality, that is, it is ubiquitous and therefore distributed in particles and cells alike. As Thomas Nagel argues, the basic physical constituents of the universe have mental properties. Broadly, panpsychism comes in two different flavors, micropsychism and cosmopsychism. The first argues that the presence of the complex cognitive process is a result of binding elemental conscious states in their micro level. The combination problem relates to the issue of explaining how unified macro experiences emerge from micro experiences. The problem for us is to explain how a singular consciousness assumes the manifold. I'm thinking in the diametrically opposite model. For both, the initial point is to reject the dichotomy between mind and matter. And in this regard, I would like to trace some historical examples. The challenge here is to analyze the issue from the top-down model rather than explaining consciousness in its complexity. The argument is that consciousness as such is non-fragmentary singularity, and that embodiment and physicality provide the required complexity to manifest in the cognitive modes, and that embodied and internal states are not emerging as a result of synthesis of basic consciousness states, but that there is a fracturing of singularity, making it possible to segment, not just in terms of different organic and cellular structures, but also in terms of different subjectivities, while also constituting the subjective and objective divide. The thesis then is that consciousness is the basis for inertia, physicality, and mentality. As a consequence, to have the body is being both a subject and also an object. This means that consciousness and materiality are not diametrically opposite entities, as the emergentists have made us believe. For the particular model being examined here, the closest counterparts can be found in what we broadly categorize as panpsychism. However, this is a broad category and we cannot make a general assumption regarding it, since the objective here is to address the specific model that is of emanation. The Sanskrit word is abhivyakti. I will explore the possible congruence with contemporary models for exploring the literature for abhivyakti. Even so, the very concept of abhivyakti is vague, and different schools have used the concept to explain different theses. But for that, it is relevant that we address the parameters necessary to address the model of emanation or abhivyakti, as the question of creation leads to the perennial problem of what does it mean for something to come into being, whether ontologically to come into existence or epistemically to be an object of veridical consciousness. As you are left with just a few options, when we say the entities come into being, are we considering that the cause and effect are identical? For in that case, causation does not make sense. And if the entity that comes into being is different, we need to further explain what difference means. Is the difference between a mother and daughter donkey the same as that between a donkey and a tree? And if not, we need to introduce a new category that addresses partial homogeneity as a precondition for causality. It is within this homogeneity that we can conceive of the class or of the universals. And thus we also need to accept the category universal or jati. If what emerges is not distinct from the source, nothing has emerged. And if what emerges is distinct from the cause, anything should give rise to anything else. The argument for emanation addresses this by accepting the generic in identity while acknowledging particularity of the manifest entity. Following physical reductionism, consciousness can be explained by explaining physical properties alone. If conscious states are the brain states, emergence is merely a device to explain the properties and not the substance. But this should then require a model of property dualism. If we follow interactionism, mental and physical properties are completely different and they interact in both directions, meaning the mental causation affects our physicality just like physical causation determines our mental states. Epiphenomenalism on the other hand, maintains that while mental and the physical properties are quite distinct, only physical properties affect the mental. In all accounts, emergentism following hard materialism rests on the argument that the mental is an emergent property of an underlying physical substrate. It is not necessary nor it is possible to revisit the arguments for and against these models. For us to move forward, we can read Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers. In particular, their arguments for the intrinsic property, what it is like, or their qualia, do not explain the qualitative state of consciousness that's absent in the corresponding physical substrate. The argument here that consciousness is an intrinsic property and cannot be fully explained externally. It will be interesting to see how and whether some of these observations can be furthered by reading the classical examples at hand. Emanation or avivyakti can only extend so far, since the contemporary discussion on panpsychism has already been nuanced and the emanation model can provide only some original insights. In that regard, this model is akin to panpsychism in the sense that they both agree that something mental extends throughout all the entities that exist. Emanation model, I'm calling EM, however, stresses that something like experience does not need to exist in the micro level. For there can be some properties manifest only in the higher order structures that are not visible in the micro level, again extending the example of the seed and the plant. We do not need micro-subjectivity for subjectivity to arise, for a simple reason that subjectivity is not a complex entity having parts. In some accounts, the emanation model can be an explanatory bridge between emergentism and panpsychism. For the EM does not require micro-experience or micro-subjectivity as a starting point. Just like red or yellow colors are not there in the rose plant but nonetheless has the potential to manifest when the rose plant blossoms, the same way several properties are latently present in the causal form even though they are not yet expressed. The EM starts from the totality, a singular entity full of life and consciousness that retains within its belly the property to be many. And the challenge here is therefore not in explaining the emergence of higher order structures, but about explaining the basic organismic and non-organic structures as a process of self-differentiation of the singular entity. Following a passage in the Mahabharata, matter and consciousness are comparable to firewood and fire. We cannot isolate and extract fire from the firewood. They are not identical nevertheless. Fire is merely an expression of the energy that is within logs. The concept of emanation, avivyakti here, is not to argue either that the element fire is original or irreducible to the log. The argument, on the contrary, is that what we call fire is merely an expression of already existing energy, manifesting merely in its external property of being a log. Now, this example allows us to identify a qualitative state as distinct from the external or objective state. The quality of being fire is intrinsic to the log, but this requires friction or certain conditions to be met for it to be expressed. It is different from the micro-experience or micro-subjectivity model because it does not assume there are any such states in the basic states of materiality. But it also is different from the physicalist emergence model in the sense that what manifests is not a radically different property and all the manifest properties are intrinsically there in the form of latency in the cause. A broadly exploited example in the literature subsequent to Mahabharata to explain the emanation is that of peacock egg. The core of the argument is that if you crack open an egg, you do not see the array of colors. But when hatched and the chicks come to maturity, we see millions of colors. This example does not explain the manifest property as a simple continuum of the cause and accepts originality of the effect. At the same time, this does not argue for a complete newness as the emergentist would have advocated. Just like the energy that manifests in fire is already present in the log, the traits for colorful feathers are likewise latent in the genetic structure in the egg. The original application of nama rupa, or name and form, is to suggest this very uniqueness of emergence, that the specific designation and particular structure are available only from the emergent property and are not present in its causal structure. That the Abhivyakti model is not reducible to common monism or panpsychism can be confirmed through two additional metaphors from the Mahabharata, given to explain the relationship between matter and consciousness, that of lac and mud. While the primary material is the bark, lac is not to be reduced to its material cause, as it emerges into something original. The example mud is used to establish the same argument, that water and soil are different elements that commingle and constitute a new entity with the new name and form of mud. But examples elucidate a new name and structure. However, we can retrieve soil and water from the mud, but shellac is a new emergent property. If we read closely, these examples are not meant to establish the primacy of consciousness, but that emergence of consciousness is a natural process. Not all the examples are the same though. Fundamentally, describing materiality from or matter or chaitanya is as commonly found as describing vijnana or intentional modes of consciousness from inertia. For no inertia is absolute inertia that lacks consciousness as its potential. This fluidity has historically confused scholars, as some have read emanation merely a classical category of reductionist physicalism. Noteworthy in the context of Mahabharata, the Vyakti or Abhivyakti here underscores continuity. That complex properties of consciousness emerge from basic elemental properties found in matter. But does this lead to the position of microsubjectivity in particular? Or are there micro-thoughts to constitute thought? Is there something like micro-transparency for the reflexivity of consciousness? I do not believe so. I'm skipping a little bit, so if it is like a gap, please forgive me. Is the emergent property distinct from the cause? One problem with the Abhivyakti or manifest model and any other model for Advaita that accepts creation is, if there is an actual causation, is the effect identical to its cause, or if this is different, how is non-duality between cause and effect confirmed? A few examples from the Upanishads and their analysis help us respond to this question. Let's say one example, like the smoke that's distinct from its cause spreads from the assemblage fire with wet logs. This creation is an exhalation of the absolute principle, Mahato Bhutasya. 2. Accordingly, this absolute principle that is endless in time and boundless in space is merely the mass of consciousness. This mass of consciousness emerges from the very basic elements of the Mahabhutas, and it dissolves back to these very elements. I'm citing the Upanishad here. So they are not just saying that this consciousness is somehow a reductionist absolute entity, but they are actually saying they are not making a categorical difference between materiality and consciousness. Just as the spider extends, another example from the Upanishad, just as the spider extends its net and reabsorbs, some of the spiders do, particularly the Australian one, and some are also found in India, that they reabsorb their net. Just as plants grow on earth, just as hair and nails of a living person, the world comes into being from the endless absolute the same way. Common to all the above examples is that the emergent property cannot be returned to its primal form. Smoke cannot be returned to the log. Conscious subjects are distinct from the elements that constitute their bodies, and a spider and its web are different. Nevertheless, these examples underscore some form of continuity. That there are some properties in the log, for example, being wet, that results in smoke. The base elements, when certain conditions have been met, give rise to life, just like spiders or orb weaves, for example, or reabsorb their web. These are not the examples to demonstrate identity, unlike the examples of gold or ornaments, or of clay and clay pots, which underscore identity. The former are the examples that underscore distinction, as even the term distinct prithak is applied to explain the distinction between smoke and the wet log. So the model of causality that can accommodate these examples is not the one that denies creation, or the model that grounds creation on difference, or the one that establishes creation as identical to its cause. There is something unique to the emergent structure, but at the same time, there is something like it is in the cause itself that is only manifest in the emergent structure. Yet again, the Abhivakti model helps explain all these examples, which works like in identity in difference. There's something that is unique, and then we can read Gilles Deleuze actually if we want to address some of the things that in difference and identity, but I'm not again going there in this paper. What I'm proposing is to invert the process. Rather than finding consciousness in complexity, accept two tiers of consciousness as the base Chaitanya or consciousness, and maintain an everyday consciousness identified as Manas as the second one. Base consciousness Chaitanya is not divided in terms of organic or inorganic. And for base consciousness, we also cannot reduce to, as Husserl or a phenomenologist after that would say, of having intentional states, because this when they are saying Chaitanya, this is like matter, and always I've also translated Chaitanya as consciousness, and that is where I find it problematic, because consciousness is intentional, and then this Chaitanya is actually not like intentional, but always the case that Vijnana is intentional. And Chaitanya is the basis of which materiality and manas or mentation both spring forth. So we have to think of a new type of metaphysics to address this. It's not lacking phenomenality or transparency, but lacking the ways these are given to us, our embodied modes of experience and our embodied subjectivity. If every cellular structure is mirroring, or in a sense encasing the same consciousness or non-differentiated being consciousness in its singularity, our organic structure makes it possible for the multiple mirroring and assemblage of emergent structures, making it possible to feel pain as pain or subjectivity as my embodied subjectivity. Someone advocating for brute emergence initiates his analysis from the basic cellular structure, studying the assemblage in the rise of complexity. What I am proposing is to explain the elementary form of embodiment and subjectivity on the basis of non-differentiated singularity, successively emerging by means of differentiation. And actually, if you read embryology, I think I am more closer to the way conscious life begins than starting from integration. What an organic structure bestows upon us is the modes of encapsulating the same singularity in a myriad of modes. In the same way, different pieces of mirrors and their assemblage makes it possible to reflect the same image in endless ways. We can initiate this analysis by exploring the converging points between Purushavada, one of the doctrines lost in the battle of better philosophies in the history of Indian philosophy, and I have explored in this model and have done some publications. To begin with, they both accept aspects of singular entity, Purusha, or you could say mental, something that constitutes aspect, the mental and physical. They introduced a new term, mental. One thing we should not conflate is that aspects are not identical to properties, and so dual aspect monism is not identical to property dualism. In property dualism, the singular ontological entity, matter, is endowed with the properties of both mind and materiality. However, for dual aspect monism, there exists only a single entity, as they call mental entity, that has aspects of both consciousness and materiality. Because of the aspect sharing a single ontological status, the problems of binary causation again emerge. Just like physical aspects, our brain structure determining the modes of experience, the same applies to the mind affecting physical states. Speaking in embodied terms, the person that I am is not merely mind or body, it is both. We can read neural monism and Purushabhada along the same lines, making manifestation as the explanatory device for causality. The category mental helps explaining reality that is neither exclusively mental nor physical. One can object to this position by pointing out that this simply tries to create a third category, a different set of entities, in order to resolve the existing problem, the problem of explaining the subjective or experiential mode of presentation versus the descriptive or objective mode of presentation. A thing, in other words, is both external and internal, has both materiality and phenomenality. This indeed is not the description of what exists, as it anticipates the manifest subjective and phenomenal modes, their expressed horizons constituting externality, and the thing that is grasped as external or as an object. There is circularity in reasoning that there is something mind-like as well as matter-like when or matter, but within or matter. But these aspects are confirmed only upon the rise of sentient beings that rely on combining micro-level consciousness and subjectivity in giving rise to macro-states. I do not see a problem in accepting mental as merely an explanatory category for what lies within the singular entity. The mental type property, in addition to physical type property, is only necessary for subjects capable of conceptualization and self-differentiation. These models require an explanatory model different from the combination theory to address consciousness, intentionality, and subjectivity, and the concept of abhivyakti meets this requirement. This is not the emergence of non-existent tropes or the properties, although this term has been much abused by materialists. The very terminal meaning of emerging doesn't explain something coming into being out of oblivion. It only explains something coming to prominence, being noticeable, or finding its distinctive identity. When fire emerges of the log, this is a transformation of the existing potential contained within the log. The biological examples examined above, like a peacock egg or the seed, explains the same phenomena, that the inherent traits or potentials within the causal form of peacock egg or banyan seed do not demonstrate the subjective or biological states of propagation and digestion, as long as they are not in their expressed form of peacock or a tree. The real issue then is not of emergence of phenomenality from inertia or of combining microsubjectivity to constitute the type of subjectivity with which we are endowed. On the contrary, it is the issue of differentiation. When we consider the singular entity as having different aspects, we are accepting the potentials within the singular entity yet to be expressed. We can credit this very mode of expression as giving rise to the two poles of subjectivity and objectivity. Similar to a person emerging from deep sleep, gaining his subjectivity and recognizing the objective world surrounding him, the matter Purusha comes to actualize its potentials as they are expressed, embracing the polarities of subject and object. The examples I've examined, such as that of the firebrand releasing sparks or of a spider spinning its web, are used to explain differentiation, where the first example simply explains the manifold, as a single spark retains the same capacity as does the flame in generating a big fire. And the spider does recognize it as something external to itself, and while maintaining a subject-object relation in sustaining its web, it is also able to reabsorb it, meaning retrieving its externality. But without a web, the spider is not subject. Subjectivity relies on objectivity. Up to this point, I have skipped all the classical examples, the translations I've made, because they basically to substantiate what I have developed as an argument. I would now like to skip to the particular point where I address physicality and phenomenality, and reading some of the materials from the Tântrica system and Mahartha system, and what it means for the conscious being, which is always an embodied being, to have embodied experience. And we are told again and again a type of non-dualism, like in Advaita or in Madhyamaka, that the body is absent in the conversation. And it's always some type of reductionism that in all sincerity does not go beyond Cartesian dualism, even when they claim to be the best of the non-dual models. So how to address materiality and how to engage physicality? Because all our conscious experiences are embodied experiences, and there is no denying to that. So I'm reading the Tantric philosopher Maheshwarananda for this, his book Mahartha Manjari, and what it does is it's like starting from an imagined body, a body image, and it starts from what is fantasized in its interacting somaticity in responses to this body trope as a body, as the imagined body and the actual body that interact, or you can say the clinical body and the flesh, like Merleau-Ponty says, and you can have the body image, and I would say that the body image is very much aligned with what Maheshwarananda says of the imagined body. My contention is that the remapping of the conceptual parameters and framing tantric philosophy in this light allows us to bring the body in discourse, because this again is broadly silent, of course not in the later part of the 20th century, but otherwise has been broadly an ignored category. And so also is the case in India, because if you go to broadly talking in Indian philosophy departments and start like a tantric philosophy, you are laughed at. You know, it's not just in the West. Actually, one of my students tried to get his PhD enrolled in Calcutta, and he wanted to work on Abhinavagupta, and he was laughed at, and I had to work so hard to have him accepted. So it's like, it's not just here, because it's all the colonized cultures have the same tendency to simply reject what they do not know, rather than have the openness just to hear it out. Before entering into the topic, I need to clarify some categories. By body image, I mean the beliefs regarding one's own body. On the other hand, body schema are sensory motor capacities that regulate somatosensory functions. Body schema provide the organized model of ourselves, allowing us to use tools to function in our given environment. For the purposes of this discussion, this understanding suffices that both body schema and body image are subject to change but are not biological processes. They are rather our cognitive and sensory negotiations of ourselves within the surroundings. For both mapping our movements in space and localizing stimulation in our body, we are constantly using this schema, even though alterations to this schema remain an unconscious process. It's a mental framework, a way of organizing knowledge, a map for us to evaluate the situation and develop a response. Following Piaget, schema is a cohesive, repeatable action sequence processing competent actions that are tightly interconnected and governed by a core meaning. Following George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, I introduced image schema as a category for the structure of our cognitive process that helps us establish patterns of understanding and reasoning. I would rather just go to example then, because that I find more interesting than just read the whole thing. I was maybe 3 when my family migrated from more like a flat Indian border area of Nepal to up in the mountains. And I was just walking ahead, meaning maybe just half an hour after we left, and I was in between. My dad had been way ahead, my mom behind with my little brother on her lap. And then they both screamed, "Go to the side, go to the side." And then I didn't know, I could hear their voice, very scared. And I rushed to the side. The street was narrow, and then something came touching both sides of the heads in that narrow street, and I didn't know what that beast was. I was mortified. I pushed myself as far as I could and started screaming, and that beast put its, now I know, the trunk and tried to touch me. It was not a wild one. It had some guy was trying to give me blessing. That's like in Indian Nepalese culture, the elephant touches you. And then I was even more scared, as you can imagine. I'd never seen something like that. And that I just survived, thanks goodness. But that fear resided within me, and till 12 I was in village up in mountain, and I went to Kathmandu. After that, up till the age of 18, I never went to the zoo, and then so I had even forgotten about that experience. And then I saw the elephant. The elephant was quite small though, but still it was elephant. I could relate to it. I was disappointed that the zoo had only a small elephant. And then I went to India. And then in India, there were bigger elephants than the one in Nepal, but they were still much, much smaller than the elephant I had seen in my childhood. And then finally, I landed in San Diego, one of the best zoos with African elephants there. And the description says the largest species of the elephants. And then that struck me. They are still smaller than the elephant I encountered. Way smaller. And I had to really think that there is something wrong with me and not with the elephant. And then the light came that at the age of 3, my size was much smaller. And the way I mapped the elephant, now for my height, the elephant had to be at least 6 stories to be as large as I could relate to at the age of 3. You see? So my experience of large elephant was not a lie, but I had mapped based on my body schema. And then now my body schema is mapping the new elephant. And I am never going to be satisfied, no matter how many of the bigger elephants I see, as long as I can't see another 6-story tall elephant to have that same level of magnitude. So this is like coming from first experience. So how this body schema works in everyday consciousness. So everything we see in the world is constantly, we are mapping based on our own body image and body schema. Combining this theory with the schema theory, we can argue that there is a passive process involved in framing and reframing this schema, which are not unconscious, albeit not actively conscious. So now I would go as much as I can skip. A body image and body schema can be cognitively engineered, resulting in the breakdown of distinction between the body and what constitutes the mind. Tantric models of what the West has called the body-mind problem emphasizes the mutual and reciprocal creation of body-mind articulation and structure. Yogic practices, particularly visualization focused on altering sensory and motor functions, demonstrate a process wherein the subject can alter his own bodily self. This makes the bridge between the body and the flesh, as Merleau-Ponty would have it. Just as the lived body is not identical with the flesh, the visualized body is not the lived body, although it does transform the subject bodily awareness, paving the path for altering sensory motor experiences. Although tantric visualization practices are focused on esoteric and liberating experiences, there is no reason this transformation cannot function as a way to generate assertive roles for subjects who feel trapped within their own epidermis. So now this is where I come to the point that why are we doing philosophy? Because we like to theorize things. But here we have an actual crisis of human experiences, and our theories, are they actually helping us transform our experiences to better our life? And in that regard, I think this yogic and tantric materials and their philosophies can bridge that gap, because they are not just interested in making some exotic theories and prove it with some mathematical logic. They are actually interested in transforming our everyday experience to make it bearable and even maybe pleasant, and if the best, then ecstatic. So, and I think that is worthwhile for us to explore. For Maheshwarananda, visualization practices are for altering the subject's body image and body schema, thus affecting their transformation. Grounded on Shakta philosophy that comes from Tântrica and many Kashmiri monastic tradition, Maheshwarananda's project of transforming embodied experience while encapsulating the totality within the lived body is originated towards cultivating mystical experiences. And again, the mystical is a Western category and very, very debatable. And I'm just like using that without critical analysis. These mechanisms have the potential to address the plasticity of bodily schema and body image, allowing subjects to address their own somatic experiences. And that is where we can have the application of philosophy to add quality in our life. Without doing drugs, I mean. For him, this visualization, particularly those focused on altered bodily forms and multiple body imagery, alter the subject's identification with the body, renegotiate the horizon of consciousness bound within the body, and amplify bodily consciousness to incorporate the totality to eventually transform the subject's assessment about himself and herself and being in the world. So the proposal is to translate in everyday language is that it is to facilitate a transformation, number one, an overall subversion of the existing body schema and body image, which also includes self-image and self-schema. Why do we need to do that? Because majority of us are finding our own physicality and our presentation in the world unsatisfactory. And as long as we do not address this is going to be more and more problematic. In my yoga philosophy or yoga sutra classes, half my students regularly address having all types of mental problems. And we are teaching complex philosophical issues, and we say for those issues, if they have anything like that, they should just go and consult the doctors. Yes, of course they should, and I also say that to keep my job, I can't pretend to address those issues, but I think as educationists, we have to really recognize the current problems that humanity faces and see if those types of problems can be addressed by reading the materials that are available to us. Maheshwarananda has identified three distinctive bodies in the passage. The first is in the insect, like I skipped the big example, that the metaphor of triviality, the body. The second is the cosmic body, the universality, the totality, because our own of this, what you call the narcissistic stage in the growth, is we find ourselves as totally expressed within the body. And then our infinitesimal presentation and our totality, these two different boards of experiences, and then this is our social interaction, is a negotiation between us experiencing as nothing and everything. The body image, so by repeatedly identifying that the world is the body image of the subject. So Maheshwarananda tries to boost one's own subjectivity first by identifying with the body, and then identify the body with the totality, in order to give the self the sense that he can actually relate to other subjects beyond his own epidermis, that he could have had the interactive, intersubjective modes of experiences by escaping the boundary of epidermis in this explain fluidity of experience, if I may. So he gives the examples of the heart, that goes beyond this pulsating flesh. And in that, so there is both corporeal and psychophysical center. The body is an expression of the heart, that in his philosophy. So also is the world is an expression of consciousness. This is the metaphoric embryonic body that the yogin finds himself within as he begins his practice, and the course of visualization evolves with him finding the totality as his own expression or expansion. I know that I can tell you these experiences are actually possible even without doing drugs, but I don't want to go into that now. So Maheshwarananda describes the unsurmountable power underlying the body within an example of an insect that is endowed with both autonomous cognitive and behavioral powers. The first, Spurana, explains the extensive expression of the self or consciousness, while the second relates to bodily fluidity. Human bodily awareness is yet another corporeality, although with greater freedom of self-expression and corporeal mobility than lower life forms. Grounding his thesis on Shiva Sutra, the entire world is the constellation of his inherent powers. Maheshwarananda argues that all that is manifest in the totality as an expression of the cosmic powers is an inherent potency of the subject expressed as if outside. So the consciousness is inside and the world outside, and mapping of the reality as if mapped or delimited by our skin, because ultimately when we go to what is inside and what is outside, we mean like mapping within our body. Consciousness is somewhere maybe in the head, I don't know where it is, and then everything is mapped as a... This inside-outside structure needs to be broken down if we want to closely analyze this non-dual philosophy of Maheshwarananda. And Maheshwarananda argues that subject, object, inside, outside are all these different categories of the ways we have evolved biologically and the way consciousness is used to map our reality, not the way it is as it is in its originality. So we could deconstruct these given modes of consciousness and go back to our primordial state and then escape this dichotomy. The expansion of bodily consciousness is one of the recurring themes in the book. Like you can actually go beyond the epidermis to feel yourself. And he gives these techniques of hundreds of visualizations of how you could actually feel yourself present beyond this body. According to Maheshwarananda, our response to the environment during bondage is controlled by our habit patterns shaped in reaction to the world, with the world as an entity outside of the self, bereft of consciousness. His philosophy rests on the assumption that greater empathy is possible by means of reversing this habit pattern, and he proposes the course of visualization towards achieving this goal. His conviction is that subjects can mirror the world and vice versa, and the self-discovery in his paradigm rests on reaffirmation of the totality as the self, and not in expunging self-consciousness further from body and the world. An insect, for Maheshwarananda, surpasses its expression of powers in relation to its body. And, like if you see the cellular level consciousness, the way even a single cell of the viruses act, the complex task like evading all our processes to analyze and to determine the acts, how complex cognitive acts they accomplish. That is the thing Maheshwarananda says, from not like a DNA strands or cellular structures, but from the tiniest of the insect he analyzes. And it's a 13th century guy talking about the complex behavior of a tiny insect. And that to me is very interesting. What is the body? For him, it's just a composite. What is it composed of? The body, accordingly, is an aggregate of previous modes of consciousness, retained in the form of samskara, the habit tendencies. Our body is just a conglomerate, an accretion of habit tendencies. That is what physicality is all about. The body accumulates what we undergo. Both, then you have the muscle memory, even in a common sense we can say, right, physically. There is not even a categorical difference between these, as what is physical is merely mental. And all that is the body is what our past modes of consciousness have experienced. So it's a continuum. There's not like a separate thing called conscious entity in absence of the body or outside of the body. And that also is not necessary, because basically we are so used to thinking, even when we say spiritual, it has to go outside of the body, and it is not necessary. It's also the capacity to express the self. And what is the self-expression? It's a bodily being in time and space. And the self-expression is also the cosmic being, because our presentation in this time and space as a continuum is something that we cannot ignore by simply sitting in meditative state and being absent as if from the world or the body. Because even that being absent from the world or the body is an experience given while in the body. No dead people come and tell you, I've been out of body experience. What grounds both subject and object is this experience. It's in this immediate mode of experience wherein the subjective meets the objective. What constitutes a subject and object is determined within the very singular flash of consciousness. That's as if it splits, and then that is the time we determine one side like internalized as the subject and externalized as an object. The event consciousness, that is, if we go to that, and that is where the non-duality of Maheshwarananda, and in that regard you will find tremendous similarity with the way Dharmakirti, the Buddhist philosopher, explains. The only difference is he insists stubbornly that has to be transitory, meaning only lasting for a single instant, and this Maheshwarananda does not say it is temporal. Body, for Maheshwarananda, is an expression of energies, with these being indistinct from consciousness or the self. He constitutes a hierarchy on which the self ascends from its materiality or descends towards inertia, both being the play of consciousness or the self. For him, this is the Swatantra Shakti, or the capacity of freedom, that bestows upon us, the individual, the possibility of self-concealment and self-illumination, with the first referring to materiality and the second to self-recognition. In the Mahartha Manjari book of Maheshwarananda, he introduces the terminology of the state wherein the world manifests with its counterpart term, the retrieval or closing of the world, Vishwanimesha, the rising of the world and the dissolving, reabsorbing of the world or externality. And this is where the body comes to play, giving rise of the sense of externality and going back to internality. And both the processes are mapped within our somatic experiences. Maheshwarananda also gives a holographic imagery of the body, saying that every cellular or organic structures mirror the totality of the body, which again is very amazing for someone in 13th century to be discussing. So what he says is the cosmos exists in the body, albeit in unmanifest form. Similar to what the Gestalt theories would propose, what we actually experience is something in alignment with our predeterminations, predispositions, and our need to see something in terms of units as wholes. The embodied self has both its natural state with the expansion of the totality and its conditioned state with the body finding its limits within the epidermis. The body image of Maheshwarananda is thus not merely a projection of new imagery, but a meticulous negation of the existing and limited body image with a thorough deconstruction of what amounts to that body prior to replacing the bodily vision, and this sequence articulates his philosophy and mediates his ritual paradigm. The metaphor of peacock egg that I had explained before is this brought again, that even while in bondage and separated from the rest of the world, the embodied subject retains his dormant capacities to eventually have the all-encompassing embodiment expressed. Liberation in his depiction is one such mode of consciousness that confirms total bodily consciousness, that not only gives full access to the body at its cellular level, but also to the entire cosmos as one's own body. Accordingly, the confinement within the epidermis is a condition and not a natural state for the self. And awakening is not a negation of the embodied self, but rather an embrace of its ultimate expression in terms of totality. One of the recurring themes in this course of visualization is that the body is an altar, that deities are to be worshipped within one's own heart, that one's self-experience is identical to the experience of the absolute subject, the God, that the way the individual subject experiences his body is identical with how the absolute subject experiences his embodiment within totality. So mapping our experiences as actually God, or whatever you could say, absolute experience, allows us to be very much not just embodied, but you can develop a philosophy of ecology on this basis, that how our experiences should be grounded on our ecology. In Maheshwarananda's philosophy, there are two stages of mirroring. In the everyday state of consciousness, there is a mirroring of the world where the self is merely cognizing mirror images. In the liberated state, both the body and the individual self appear as if the mirror image. Here, the outside becomes the inside and the inside morphs into the outside. The totality becomes the source and the body the target. How does Maheshwarananda envision such a possibility? The response rests on his epistemology and cosmology. He understands consciousness in terms of energy. Sensory faculties are further extensions of this very energy, and the self is the core or a unified field of consciousness. In his epistemology, sensory faculties are the energies of the self, and a mandala with center and periphery describes his image of the self and the sensory capacities. Even when these energies are scattered in the world, these are the very aspects of the self, the sparks of consciousness often equated with fire, Chit Agni or Chit Vani. In passively or naturally engaging with the world, the self is fragmented into pieces as sparks of consciousness. For Maheshwarananda, body image and body schema are therefore flexible. We can morph our body image into something new, and meticulous visualization can constitute the new synaptic structures and habit patterns to alter our body schema. Is the imagery that he provides absolutely real? In his own metaphysics, both the internal and external acts of worship as well as meticulous visualizations are merely for the alteration of the subject's horizon of consciousness. These are devices. Actually, Bhartrihari, a much earlier philosopher, says, Asatya vartmani sthitva tatah satyam samihate. Upaya shikshamananam balanam upalalana asatya vartmani sthitva tatah satyam samihate. Meaning, we knowingly, consciously follow a path that is not absolute, only as a device to describe something, and the ultimate thing is not the example but the target. So while the example is not real, that example is only to help us understand something more pristine. So Maheshwarananda openly says that I'm using these just to show, thus because these are your habit patterns, habit tendencies, and you have mapped your everyday reality based on the schema you are used to, or the body image you are used to. Let me give you an alternative, and you start thinking you are so full and the cosmic cosmic and connected with the totality. And then, is this remapping necessary, or is this remapping the absolutely real entity? He says, no. I just wanted to tell you that just like your used to experiences were not absolutely real, what I'm giving you as a habit is yet another projected reality, so that you could actually reach to the core, the basis of consciousness, and actually get to the core of the way conscious experiences manifest, and not get dogmatically stuck to the way we are used to, whether biologically or culturally, to interpret our everyday experiences. And that is where I would like to stop. And I wanted to give plenty of time for our conversation. And thank you so much for your patience. And I skipped a bunch, and anybody interested, I'm happy to share the paper. It's the paper itself is like 15,000 words, and I may have read maybe 5,000 out of that. That is why I was jumping like everywhere. And I appreciate it again. Thank you so much.
E agora abrimos para perguntas.
Mike, anybody gonna give them the mic?
Como é que você falou?
Danilo. Oh, what we can do?
Ele pode falar repetindo.
You and I can share this, and then you can give it to them.
Ok.
Yeah?
Eu consigo levar esse microfone para eles?
Tá bom.
Eu repito. No, they're saying I will repeat the question in the microphone.
Okay. So they don't need the mic?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry. That's a problem of language.
Não, pode começar.
Você quer que eu use o microfone? Porque eu falo alto, assim, tipo, todo mundo...
Não, pode falar e depois eu vou repetir em inglês e vai estar gravado.
Ask the question, say in English, and then translate to Portuguese.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for you to be here. Very grateful with your presence. Sorry if the questions are a bit silly. I would like really to have access to the paper, to read it a few times. But one simple question and then another a little more complicated. The first is our friend here that present you, he mentioned that you study when you were a child completely fully the Yajur
Veda, yeah.
Veda. And my question is, why the Yajur Veda
among so many different Vedas? Yeah. No, that's not an irrelevant question. Although he could have escaped that part. It was such a personal thing. I can't let him know anything. In America, I could be fired for that. No, not really. But people start looking at this guy is so exotic, not like a rational being. But the thing is, in India or Nepal, among the Pandits, these Vedic texts are divided. I don't know since when, maybe at least for the last 2,000 years, this has been the case, that there are so many, not just 4 different Vedas, but each has like Brahmana text and the Upanishad text, and one individual could not keep it like memorize all. So for different family, we call Gotra, they assigned particular Veda, and that way the family within that own lineage could continue memorizing that book. It's just imagine we are like 50 of us here, and then we got like this big ginormous book, and then we divide into 50 chapters so that you can teach your children to memorize, and we can continue to keep the entire book. So it was before they had the scripts, they could have the library, and then they retain these classical learnings by human archives or human libraries. So I was just one of the books in that classical library.
Family tradition.
Yeah, memory tradition, yeah.
The other question is, among my teachers, my main teacher used to say that the form without the formless is useless. And I see this effort to translate Sanskrit to English. It's very interesting. But I kind of think personally that's almost impossible to translate Sanskrit to English. But my question, very simple, is like, do you believe that in a general way, not only the Western world, but in the whole world today, we tend to ignore the role or too much minimize the role of emotion, the perception of consciousness, and then we kind of, because of this minimization or denial of emotion, we tend to go to a kind of sad, depressive, or even mad way to understand reality.
I completely agree with you. And for that, I have to start with, again, a cultural example. My first trip to the West was to Italy, and before I even landed, the way Mussolini envisioned Rome, it's a sense of perfection. I still think that if there is perfection in the world, that is in Rome. And and then I landed there, my first, again, being outside of Nepal or India. And then my friends picked me up, all smiling, of course, very happy people. And then, it took me I was there for 6 weeks in the first trip. And everywhere I go, in every corner, so happy people. And everybody is smiling. If you ever have been to India or Nepal, you can see people quarreling, fighting in the street corners, crying, wailing. There are people grieving, the dead body being carried. And and the wedding goes right on the next procession, the dead body. Everything is happening out in the open, and Rome was perfection. Everybody was just only happy. And but okay. Now how we have made the condition of masking our actual being, our emotional being, to present ourselves. One day my wife comes from office jokingly saying, I may need to do some plastic surgery because today a client said, why do I look so grumpy or angry? Because we brown people, if we are not constantly making our face like that, can be immediately misunderstood as angry, So we expect people to be all the time laughing, and it's not even a laughing matter. And then, yes, I'm working on time. It's kind of funny. I started working on emotion. I wrote a whole book-size materials and developed a bunch of courses. That's funny you brought up. I have published 4 or 5 articles on the rasa and emotion. Some book chapters and some articles in that, but I also had a bigger project and all the drafts I haven't been able to finish, as much as imagination. Again, not just emotion. And I find I've worked more on imagination after that, because I found that just like emotion, another thing we have completely ignored is fantasy consciousness. And why? Because our reading, you go to sciences or philosophy, we are rational being. Our rationality is so epitomized. You know what? We are not that rational, okay? Think anything is rational. Do you guys see, in the big picture? Maybe in your personal life, you are doing a lot of rational things, but in the national scale and the global scale, can you really say we have been doing such rational things? I mean, we are not rational creatures, okay? Not fully rational, I mean. So, but we have given up on any serious consideration on our fantasy consciousness. Husserl did study image consciousness fantasy, but it could have gone to a beautiful direction, like with Jean-Paul Sartre. I love him for addressing these, but could have gone to further, developing some actual devices to help us ground human consciousness in finding a balance between, of course, just our emotional being as much as our fantastic being. I'm a real being tied in this body. Maybe sometimes I feel trapped if I'm not satisfied with my physicality, and conditioned if I'm emotionally boiling. But at the same time, my real world is constantly a negotiation between what I think I am and what the rest of you guys think I am. And that is where fantasy comes to play. Because what I think or I imagine is just fantasy, right? And what you think, that's also not real. Just because it is you thinking about me, you think that is more real than what I am thinking about me, but then that's also another fantasy. So how to negotiate between fantasies, we should have taken more closely these readings and traits. So emotion, yes, denied. Imagination, denied, more or less, from serious consideration. And I think that at least in 21st century, we find serious interest in that. Good works are happening both on image and then also on emotion. Thank you so much.
Ele faz duas perguntas, né? A primeira pergunta, que havia sido mencionado que você estudou quando criança o Yajurveda. E a minha questão é, por que o Yajurveda? Por que esse dentre todos os Vedas? Minha resposta: na Índia ou no Nepal, entre os Panditas, esses textos védicos são divididos, não sei desde quando, mas talvez nos últimos 2000 anos, de tal modo que há tantos textos, não apenas os 4 Vedas, mas cada um tem seus Brahmanas e Upanishads, e o indivíduo não conseguiria manter tudo isso memorizado. Então, para cada família ou linhagem familiar, ou Gotra, é prescrito um Veda particular para que aquela linhagem familiar possa continuar memorizando aquele livro. Então imagina que nós tenhamos um livro gigante e nós dividimos entre nós que aqui estamos, de tal modo que cada um memorizasse um capítulo para que assim pudéssemos mantê-lo vivo, como se fosse uma biblioteca humana. E nessa biblioteca eu sou como que apenas um livro. A segunda pergunta. Dentre os meus professores, e meu principal professor, ele costumava ser que a forma sem a não forma é inútil. Eu vejo esse esforço de traduzir o sânscrito para o inglês, mas pessoalmente eu penso que é impossível. Mas a minha questão é, você acredita ou pensa que, numa forma geral, não apenas o mundo ocidental, mas todo o mundo, nós tendemos a ignorar o papel das emoções, e como que por causa dessa negação, nós tendemos a ficar tristes ou depressivos ou loucos, ou na nossa forma de entender a realidade? E a resposta: eu totalmente concordo. E vou dar um exemplo cultural. A minha primeira viagem para o Ocidente foi para a Itália. E chegando lá, eu vi o modo como Roma foi organizada, né, como para ser uma cidade perfeita. É a cidade mais perfeita que eu já vi. Então, essa é a minha primeira vez fora do Nepal e da Índia. Meus amigos me buscaram e eram pessoas muito amigáveis, todo mundo feliz, todo mundo sorrindo. Todo lugar que eu ia na cidade, em todos os cantos, as pessoas estão tão felizes, sempre sorrindo. E na Índia ou no Nepal, se você vai lá e anda pelas ruas, as pessoas estão brigando, estão se lamentando, corpos mortos sendo carregados, e tudo acontecendo no aberto. Mas a Roma é a perfeição, todo mundo está feliz. Como é que a gente pode ter transformado numa condição humana, mascarar o nosso ser emocional? Um dia, minha esposa veio do escritório brincando que talvez eu possa precisar de uma cirurgia plástica, porque um paciente veio e perguntou por que eu estou sempre com a cara meio de brava. É como se nós, pessoas marrons, se a gente não tivesse sempre sorrindo daquela forma, podemos ser interpretados como estando com raiva. E eu trabalhei em bastante materiais a respeito do tema emoções, alguns dos quais eu publiquei como artigos, mas eu acabei depois focando num projeto maior que eu tenho a respeito do tempo. E assim como com a emoção, o mesmo vale para a imaginação. É um dos tópicos a respeito dos quais eu mais trabalhei. Então, não apenas a emoção, mas outra coisa que nós ignoramos completamente é a consciência fantasiosa, né, da fantasia. Nós vamos para a ciência, a filosofia, e somos ali, né, seres racionais, nossa racionalidade é tão centralizada. Mas nós não somos tão racionais assim. Nós não podemos dizer, numa escala nacional ou global, que nós estamos realmente fazendo coisas tão estritamente racionais. Nós somos racionais, mas não totalmente, né? Então, nós abandonamos qualquer consideração real sobre a consciência imagética. Husserl estudou algumas coisas sobre a consciência imagética. Ele também mencionou Sartre. Mas ele poderia ter ido muito mais longe e de fato, desenvolver mecanismos para nos ajudar a equilibrar e enraizar nossa consciência. E eu sou um ser real, atado a este corpo, a um corpo, e eu posso me sentir aprisionado se eu não estou satisfeito com a minha fisicalidade. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, o meu mundo real é uma negociação entre o que eu penso que eu sou e o que você pensa que eu sou. E é aí que a imaginação tem o seu lugar. Quando eu penso sobre mim e o que você pensa sobre mim, ambos são fantasias. Como negociar entre fantasias? Então, emoções e imaginação são ambos negados de considerações sérias. Mas, ao menos agora, no século XXI, alguns bons trabalhos têm acontecido a respeito desses dois temas. Pode fazer daí aqui.
Em português. São duas coisas. Uma é se ele pudesse dar exemplos desses exercícios de visualização que ele mencionou, dessas práticas de visualização, só para ter uma ideia do que é. Não sei se eu perdi isso no inglês, né? De qualquer forma, eu queria saber mais o que é isso. E outra coisa, aí é uma coisa que eu venho pensando há um tempo, a influência da medicina por imagem na constituição do esquema corporal e da imagem corporal. Né? Eu sou psicanalista, sou aqui da filosofia, sou psicanalista também, trabalhei psicossomático um tempo, então por isso que eu fui para esse assunto. E na Montanha Mágica do Thomas Mann tem os pacientes no sanatório, eles andam com um vidrinho com a radiografia do pulmão deles, né? Amarrada na roupa, me faz pensar como se fosse parte do corpo. Né? Então não sei se existem referências nesse pensamento que ele traz para pensar esse tipo de coisa, né? O que a tecnologia, né, e principalmente a medicina por imagem altera ou acrescenta ou modifica na nossa percepção de esquema corporal, de imagem corporal.
He asks, he made two questions also. So maybe we want to break them down. The first one is shorter. Would you please offer some examples of these visualization exercises that you referred to, just so I have an idea of what they are about?
There are really many visualization examples. For me to pick one to meet that would be tough. But let me pick from two examples. There is one Hindu deity called Ganesha. And this is a very funny god. I'm sorry, please God, don't mind. And because he got the head of an elephant and the body as of a boy, like a fat boy with a huge pot belly, and who got a ride of a mouse. And this asymmetric representation that has this some sort of a bizarreness. And this bizarreness in visualization, what it does every day, like if you go to a park, you are walking by the road, you go from your house to your office, and then you return back home, and then you say, oh, did you see something interesting? You would say, no, nothing. But then, if you see one person like little crazy and dancing in the street, very abnormal, or a car crash, or something, someone just like opening the hood of the car and maybe dancing naked, and then you would say, oh my gosh, there was some crazy, this was happening. So this is a bizarreness as a phenomenon, one of the aspects for the mind to register. Normals, we don't register. Abnormal, we register. So that is one trait of visualization practices. Another, we give the deity and tell my students that the goddess has 18 arms, not 19, not 2. And who cares like 18? That is never even, nobody has 18 hands. That is why you have to visualize that. Otherwise it becomes normal and there is not an exercise. There is no extension. That it's in all the visualization practices, what we are doing is giving uncommon objects, not the everyday objects. And then like that is why we have a perfectly beautiful woman sitting on top of a lotus. For heavens, who can sit on top of a lotus? She would collapse. Or on top of a duck. I mean, the ducks are not very good for a ride. So because of this uncommonness, people capture in their mind. So the idea is not about whether this is good, rational, common. The idea is about how long can you retain. They become remarkable. So rather than just thinking of a Rama, that's a Hindu legendary god, people like to think about the monkey head he had called Hanuman, because he's kind of different. He's a man and the monkey, you know. So that is more kind of good for human consciousness to register than everyday type of guy, no matter what he's called. So these are like, maybe we can go, you know, in later times to talk about why or how it aids and how to register in sustained practices. But the basic idea is to give something not so common, and then the mind starts registering the uncommon phenomena. Thank you.
And the second question he makes is, and how about the influence of medicine through image in the constitution, in corporal image and in bodily schema? I'm a psychoanalyst and I've worked with psychosomatics. In Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, patients in the madhouse, I don't know, sanatorium. They walk with small glasses with the radiographical image of their lungs, as if those images are part of their own body. Are there references in the thought you bring that could help us to think the way image technology, especially in medicine, alters our perception of bodily schema and bodily image?
One quick example comes from my childhood trauma. I grew up in a very compromised environment and left home too early, like at the age of 12, and I lived with trauma. So I met my meditation teacher at the age of 16, and I used to have nightmares more or less every day. I would wake up every night screaming, and after meditating for about 2 years, maybe 1.5 years, what happened is I had this image of a man lion. Okay, I was supposed to imagine myself as half lion and half human. You may have seen this funny image, man lion, like a sphinx. You can think of like a sphinx. And then there are some verbalizations, like some phonemes you repeat and you become that man lion. And then in a repeated pattern of the nightmares would be some dark figures chasing after or some beasts chasing after. And then when the same pattern dream occurred, and one of the times what happened is I thought I have the mantras, like the magical power, and I'm a man lion. I can eat this beast. And that I simply turned back, and then instead of letting him chase me after, I started chasing him after. And then I just somehow managed to pounce on him with my actual lion hands. And then I woke up And that was more or less into the pattern of my nightmares, that I never have had this repeated or recurring nightmares. And even later times, maybe once a month or maybe once a 6 months, whenever I had at least some type of situation walking through dark, I always would feel like I am so powerful. The basic thing of how these body schema or how these fantasies given to subject transforms subject's experience is when we are weak, we are abused, and we live through trauma. And then when the subject is projected a different consciousness, I'm not a man lion, okay? I mean, that's just another fantasy. Just like I'm a feeble, weak child that anybody can beat me up or toss me in any corner and can kill me, and I have to just run to save my life. That is another nightmare too. So this is a collision of one experience I'm living through, I'm living with, and another is a counter experience that makes me so bold, so empowered. And who cares whether that another fantasy consciousness is false or even more false than my abused and repressed childhood experience of a victim consciousness. But the ultimate thing is the transformation of my victim consciousness to the empowered being that I can do or achieve what I want to, because I'm a powerful being, I'm a divine entity, I have these magical powers, like the alchemist in a sense. So this is, I could say, as an example for that. Thank you.
Só um instante, pessoal. Ok. Então, a pergunta foi feita em português, vocês lembram, né? Quanto à primeira pergunta sobre um exemplo de exercício de visualização, ele comenta em resposta. Há realmente muitos exemplos de visualização. Para eu escolher um que seria difícil, mas deixe-me tomar 2 exemplos. Há uma deidade hindu chamada Ganesha, que é um deus engraçado, né? Por favor, não, Deus, não se zangue comigo. Ele tem a cabeça de um elefante, o corpo como de um garoto gordo e um veículo que é um rato. Então essa representação assimétrica tem algum tipo de qualidade bizarra na visualização. E o que isso provoca, e como que isso funciona, né? Ele dá um exemplo. Se você vai a um parque ou caminha na rua, na estrada, da casa para o escritório, depois você retorna para casa e alguém pergunta se você viu alguma coisa interessante, se algo captou sua atenção, você diz não, nada. Mas se você vê um cara doido dançando de forma anormal nas ruas, ou uma batida de carros, isso captura sua atenção através dessa característica de ser algo bizarro. Então a consciência retém o anormal, não o normal. Então há uma deusa que é visualizada como tendo 18 braços, não 19 ou 2. Por que 18? Ninguém tem 18 mãos. Mas é por isso que você tem que visualizar aquilo. Em todas as práticas de visualização, nós somos concedidos objetos incomuns. Por exemplo, uma mulher perfeitamente bela sentada sobre um lótus. É claro que ninguém consegue sentar sobre um lótus. Ou sentada sobre um pato. Né? Bom, o pato não é um bom veículo. Mas essa característica de algo incomum permite que as pessoas retenham aquilo na mente, e isso porque torna elas distintivas, essas imagens distintivas. Mas nós podemos discutir sobre isso num outro momento. Agora, quanto à segunda questão, sobre como que a tecnologia de imagens muda a nossa imagem corporal e nosso esquema corporal, e se tem algo no pensamento que ele traz que nos permite tratar dessas questões. E a resposta. Um exemplo rápido vem do meu trauma de infância. Eu cresci num ambiente muito comprometido e deixei a minha casa muito cedo, na idade de 12 anos, e vivi com trauma. Eu encontrei meu professor de meditação aos 16. E nessa época eu costumava acordar toda noite com pesadelos. E depois de meditar por 2 anos, eu tinha essa imagem de um homem-leão. Eu deveria imaginar a mim mesmo, né, como metade leão e metade humano, parecido com uma esfinge. E havia algumas verbalizações, alguns fonemas, e com essa contemplação você se torna um homem-leão, né? E aqueles padrões de pesadelos repetidos eram de monstros me perseguindo e eu correndo deles. E quando de repente esse mesmo padrão começou a ocorrer, no meio do sonho eu pensava, eu tenho os mantras, os poderes mágicos, eu sou um homem-leão, eu posso comer devorar esses monstros. Então eu me voltei, ao invés de deixar que eles me perseguissem, eu persegui eles. E eu consegui colocar a minha pata de leão, né, sobre eles e assim eu acordei e esse foi o fim do padrão desses pesadelos, né, que não se repetiram da mesma forma mais. Quando eu caminhava em situações como ruas escuras, eu sentia que eu era poderoso. Então, isso transforma a sua experiência subjetiva. Né? Quando nós temos uma autoimagem de uma pessoa fraca, abusada, né? Com trauma, nós projetamos uma imagem baseada nisso. Eu sou uma criança fraca que as pessoas podem me bater, eu tenho que correr e salvar minha vida. Então, dessa forma nós provocamos uma colisão de uma experiência com uma contra-experiência. Uma contra-experiência que me faz mais ousado e empoderado. E quem se importa se essa consciência se essa fantasia, né, é falsa? Então pode até ser mais falsa do que as experiências, né, de violência infantil. Mas, em última instância, trata-se de uma transformação da consciência vitimizada para uma consciência empoderada, como nesse caso de uma entidade divina, poderosa.
Way in the back was first, and then yeah, he was first. Yeah, sorry, he was first. Okay.
Good afternoon, Charlie. I saw your path from Tântrica and Indian philosophy, then go to the more Western type of philosophy of mind. And that was very interesting for me because I did the opposite direction. I went from the philosophy of Coordenação and Anglo-Saxon mind, and that led me to Tantra. Said that, I would like to ask you something very specific about the meaning that we can apprehend from the actualization of the question, what is consciousness, that is asked in both the traditions. And I see a more guided purpose on the Indian, the direction that it goes, because instead of looking just an epistemological solution, it goes to a more complete solution, in the sense that it goes to the ontological part of us, and what it means ultimately. And I want to ask you, you cited the Thomas Nagel paper from the What is a Bat? And it's very interesting because if you dissect a bat, you can't find the qualia experiences of the bat, even if you maintain it alive in some like Frankensteinian sense, you know. But there is maybe the final way to understand what is a bat is to put yourself in the place of the bat. And if you can imagine what it's like to be a bat, maybe you are a bat in this imagination. final sense, I want to understand. It's possible to do this not only with a bat, but with the whole existence, like God or the universe. And I want to understand it's possible to apprehend implications. Thank you.
I don't know if I got the whole thing. You want to translate the question first, or just I go and then you translate both question and answer?
I translate both.
Okay. Let's hope I understood the question. The first thing was about consciousness. Rather than exoticizing consciousness, Advaita, Vedanta, transcendent, Madhyamaka, the interdependent, I will go to a prominent Advaita Vedanta philosopher, Vidyaranya, 14th century, and read a verse from his book, Panchadashi, the first of the chapter. Ene kshate srinavotidam jigrati vyakaroti cha swadva swadu vijanati tat prajnanam udahritam. So what is this consciousness? Is by means of which we see, we smell, we hear, we taste, and we evaluate, judge whether it is tasting or not. It is tasteful. We make a judgment. So, number one, there is a phenomenality immediately expressed of what it amounts to be conscious. He is not saying consciousness is something transcendent and not found through or in our bodily actions. Whatever Vedanta's consciousness is not some supernatural thing he's talking about. It is our everyday embodied modes of experiences. And what it has is, it has this originality. It has transparency. Of course, some would reject the transparency of experience, but from the Advaita perspective, they agree. Reflexivity, I would add also, that instantaneously, not just being aware of, but what it is like, givenness of always immediacy and givenness of consciousness. And within that, how the translation of consciousness works, I had one of my students with synesthesia. Synesthesia is when your neural synapses intermingle and your sensory perception kind of translate as something else. The auditory perception translates into visual perception translates into auditory perception, and then you start seeing the sound or hearing the colors, and that just doesn't even make sense to me, because I would need to have that same condition to even, I accept him, I'm not rejecting his experience, he's not lying. And Ramachandran, before Ramachandran did phenomenal work on synesthesia, this particular symptom was broadly denied and called like completely abnormal or lie, so it was not even taken seriously. Now we know a big percentage of people actually do have types of synesthesia. So what it is like to have echolocation, because that's where the issue of bat consciousness comes, right? What does it mean to have sonar sight? That's almost in the human case, maybe people with synesthesia would have something to map with, like, okay, this is what it is like. But to me, that only means one thing, that our sensory modalities are the mechanisms to translate conscious experience and not to give rise to conscious experience. Why? Is because these sensory modes could translate the visual into auditory experience when our translator, which are the neural correlates, are jumbled together or assigned differently, connected in different places. If they were the mechanisms for the emergence of consciousness, we could never have had that type of confusion. These are the translating devices, I would say. And yes, they are also giving sensations, providing to us, but then what that transparent conscious experience emerges, we are constantly mapping how to understand this particular phenomena, this particular experience, and then that particular experience happens to be auditory experience, this particular experience happens to be like color experience, maybe in the another galaxy, in another completely different environment, there are species with completely different type of sensory faculties, and they, instead of seeing, they do eating or being or whatever we like to call, and they don't do things we do, and I think that consciousness manifests or translates within the given environment of our body, but not necessarily that this is the only true form of consciousness. So therefore, we should be able to go dig deeper than even our physical presentation of consciousness and say, not just based on echolocation, but based on synesthesia, that yes, experiences are actually different than the way they are translated through our sensory nodes. Thank you.
A pergunta diz que eu vi o seu caminho de Tantra e filosofia indiana movendo para o tipo ocidental de filosofia da mente. E foi interessante para mim porque eu fiz o caminho contrário, indo da filosofia ocidental para indiana e Tantra. Com isso dito, eu gostaria de perguntar algo muito específico sobre o sentido que nós podemos aprender da realização da questão o que é a consciência, que é uma questão feita em ambas as traduções. Eu vejo um propósito mais dirigido na visão indiana, porque ao invés de apenas olhar para uma solução epistemológica, ela apenas vai até ela prossegue também para uma solução completa, indo para a nossa dimensão ontológica e também no que tange ao significado último. E eu gostaria de te perguntar, você citou o artigo de Thomas Nagel sobre como é ser um morcego. E se você dissecar um morcego, você não consegue encontrar ali o qualia da experiência do morcego, mesmo se você de algum modo consegue mantê-lo vivo. Mas talvez há um modo final de entender o que é um morcego, e isso pode ser colocar você a si mesmo no lugar do morcego, imaginar o que é ser como um morcego. Talvez assim você pode ser um morcego em imaginação. É possível fazer isso não apenas com o morcego, mas também com toda a existência, com Deus e o universo. É possível aprender as implicações disso. E a resposta? Eu espero que eu tenha entendido a questão. Quanto à consciência, ao invés de exoticizar a consciência, falando, Vedanta fala da transcendência, Madhyamaka da interdependência, eu gostaria de ir até Vidyaranya, um filósofo do Vedanta do século XIV, e ler um verso do seu livro Panchadashi a respeito da consciência. Ele cita o verso e traduz. O que é essa consciência? Ela é aquilo por meio do qual nós vemos, por meio do qual nós sentimos o cheiro, pelo meio do qual nós escutamos, nós saboreamos, nós julgamos. Então, em primeiro lugar, há uma fenomenalidade imediatamente expressa no que ser consciente aqui. Ele não está dizendo que é algo transcendente, não encontrado nas ações corporais. O que quer que a consciência no Vedanta seja, ela não é algo supernatural. Ela é algo vivenciado como a consciência do dia a dia. E ela tem essa originalidade, transparência, reflexividade, esse aspecto de instantaneidade do que é ser como aquilo, do que é ser consciente. Então, aquilo que faz com que a consciência seja dada. E dentro disso, nós temos o problema de tradução de como a consciência funciona. Um dos meus estudantes tem sinestesia, assim que fala em português? Sinestesia. Que é quando as sinapses neurais se mixam e uma percepção sensorial é traduzida como uma outra. Então, uma percepção visual é traduzida como uma percepção auditória e vice-versa. E de tal forma que você começa a ver sons e a escutar cores. Isso não faz sentido para mim, porque eu não tenho essa mesma condição. Mas eu aceito que ele não estava mentindo, né? Esse sintoma particular foi um dia negado como algo anormal e não era levado a sério. Mas hoje nós sabemos que uma grande porcentagem das pessoas de fato tem algum tipo de sinestesia. E da mesma forma, como é ter ecolocação, né, como os morcegos, que tem uma percepção através dos sons. Daí teve uma parte que eu perdi um pouquinho aqui, mas eu tentei pegar a essência que o que ele está entendendo é que nessas experiências é como se nós pudéssemos perceber que as nossas modalidades sensoriais são mecanismos através dos quais traduzimos a experiência consciente, não aquilo que origina a experiência consciente. Porque é isso que permite que a gente pense numa modalidade de consciência e traduza ela em outra modalidade. Então, se nós podemos usar a consciência para traduzir uma forma de consciência sensorial em outra forma de consciência sensorial, então, a consciência os sentidos, né, as formas sensoriais de consciência são mecanismos de tradução. Eles, de fato, provêm com as sensações. Mas nós estamos constantemente mapeando como entender esse fenômeno e experiência particular, essa experiência auditória em particular, essa experiência visual em particular. Né? E talvez numa outra galáxia, num ambiente completamente diferente, haja espécies com tipos diferentes de faculdades sensoriais. E elas não fazem as mesmas coisas que nós fazemos. Eu penso que a consciência manifesta ou traduz dentro da nossa corporeidade, mas que isso não é a única forma verdadeira da consciência. Nós deveríamos ser capazes de cavar mais a fundo do que a representação física da consciência. E nós podemos pensar nisso a partir do exemplo da sinestesia.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your talk. I would have many questions for you, but I will try to focus only on one. And first of all, I would like to say, also for everyone present, that we from the Intercultural Network, Latin American Network on Intercultural Philosophy, ALAPH, we have organized with the University of Passo Fundo an specialization in intercultural philosophy. The inscriptions are open for anyone who is interested, and we would love to have you at some point as an invited professor to talk. It's entirely online, so it would be great to have you there with us. So, like I said, I would have so many questions regarding the more technical, conceptual discussion you presented. Maybe I can only make one in the sense that from your exposition, what I gathered is that the way you think about causality implies that base consciousness is always manifesting itself. There's no such thing as base consciousness without manifestation, because that would raise the question of when does causality arise and why, so it's always happening in a way. I would like to know if that is correct. Again, from all the questions I could ask, I think maybe the one that would be more interesting for the discussion here right now is, and of course it's a very difficult issue, is how do you think there is a connection with this presentation of the problem of consciousness and our current debate on AI, on AI, on artificial intelligence? I mean, do you think this connects somehow? Could this help with the discussion about to what extent AI is conscious or not? What does it do in there? Is it somehow manifesting intelligence, cognition, or whatnot? Do you think the way you framed the problem of consciousness could help somehow with this discussion? And just one final comment that I would like to make. I think it's really fascinating the way you presented this perspective, also relating to the one Sanskrit word I understood when you said that was upaya. So yeah, I think it's the very way you described this perspective, that in a way philosophical discourse can be seen as upaya, meant to bring you closer to this sort of experience of belonging to this whole, seems to me actually very connected to this other way of reading Western philosophy itself that is presented by Hadot in his books on philosophy as a way of life, where he argues that for ancient Greek philosophy, the main purpose of philosophical discourse was not elaborating sophisticated theories meant to explain things in a theoretical way, but rather they were spiritual exercises meant to contribute, among other things, to bring about this sort of cosmic consciousness, this experience of my true self, of this true self that is not merely individual, so to speak. And then philosophical discourse was merely upaya in that sense. It could change, it was flexible, it was adaptable, it wasn't meant to be an absolute theory of everything. So this might be a very interesting point to draw connections between those traditions, but that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Again, in there, these are only few questions, and I don't think I can, even within that, answer many of the things. I would appreciate it if we could continue our conversation through email, or these days Zoom or WhatsApp or God knows what not, So, so we can, philosophy for me is primarily vimarsha, meaning having a conversation. And it doesn't have to have a goal, because to me, conversation is the goal. And it doesn't need to lead to something else. Our fundamental problem in society is not having good conversation. And if we can have a healthy conversation, we don't need all the issues addressed. That's, we share our feelings by just having little smile and have a cup of coffee. Anyway, two things on causality. If we go to philosophers like Nagarjuna, or from the Advaita like Gaudapada, the concept of causality doesn't make sense. And actually, if we think of even in our ordinary experiences, causality is superimposed. Like, for example, you say some words that I cannot take it culturally. Let us say I am used to get really mad hearing the words. And then I put a sense of causality that because you said so, therefore, I had to get mad. But there is no causal relation, okay? It's just like I am assigning the value. Now time, boy, get up, get mad. But I can say I don't need to get mad, and then I wouldn't get mad. So all these, if you do this, then this has to happen. All these are assigned values for random things, and then we can go back to question the whole sense of causality. So rather than emergence of completely two different categories of the cause and effect can be flatly denied just on that. But then I would not say therefore that nothing has ever occurred. That to that level of absolute emptiness, because for me, I'm not trying to be the Buddha, I'm trying to live a normal life. And to explain my mundane experiences, to enjoy the company of my friends, and to enjoy good food when they let me have. So for me, my somaticity is mostly that matters. Even though these guys who said, let me learn Tantra, so they don't know what they are up to, because ultimately I'm going to tell them to enjoy life. And so there is something happening. And is this happening a random effect of completely diametrical emergence or not is the question. And then that is where I'm bringing this abhivyakti, a sense of manifestation. Some potentials are already there, and all these conditioning factors that somehow allow, like this morning the friend was showing me a date and says, can you believe it takes 16 years for the seed to even come to sprout? And I said, look, if you want a quick sprout and the fruit, plant a tomato, 3 months and done. You have the fruit, so don't plant the date. So, but still, there are these traits, potentials, and they emerge. And not like they are diametrically opposite entities. The potentials are there. A peacock egg can only give rise to peacock and not eggplant. If anything could happen from anything. But then there is just some kind of difference in cause and the effect, a minute, whatever to the extent. And we should not either insist in identifying called Advaita and making a diametrical opposition between cause and effect, say the Dvaita. That is why I invoke difference and repetition of Gilles Deleuze. I know some hardcore philosophers or scientists like to laugh at. With the philosophers, we are not scientists like them. But the regrettable thing, my friend, I have to come to the point that I go and listen to these ginormous philosophers in the philosophy department, and I kind of regret thinking I wasted my time. I should have gone and just listened to the physicists. Or the biologist. They I'm sorry to be so stereotypical here, but these philosophers are amazingly wise people, but they are reducing their department into some type of an appendix to physics, and they don't need philosophers, by the way, okay? They can explain all the physical entities completely without philosophers, and they don't need philosophers to explain biology either. They can completely do it without. So philosophers in the modern departments of philosophy have made themselves a laughingstock and redundant. So therefore, if we have to reinvent what is the scope and objective of philosophy, and then we should go back to, it doesn't need like going to China or like go to Laozi, or we can go back to pre-Socratic philosophy, what it was for to begin with. And not try to fit within the crowd of so-called scientists and then sacrifice the whole heart of philosophy. At least that is kind of, if I'm biased, I think that way, that we should go back to our roots rather than trying to reduce our entire department in order to fit. Would it address some kind of artificial intelligence? Is there? That is the last thing. I have no idea. And I would go and at least this is, I forgot his name. The only type of consciousness we know is a biological type of consciousness. Sir? So, yeah. So, does that mean that ChatGPT can never be conscious, like a system, or my robot is never gonna understand my feelings? A lot of understanding is superimposed. I'm not trying to insult, generalize, but I read somewhere, a little funny, therefore I'm not trying to be a serious philosopher. Anyway, nobody cares like people doing Indian philosophy as a serious philosopher. So I can make as many jokes as I like, So in Japan, I was reading about the graveyard for the dolls. What do you do with your sex dolls when you can't just dump them. You are emotionally involved by like having them for 5 years, 10 years, So now you need a priest also, like for the ritual burial of your sex dolls. We human beings are fantastic creatures. And we can make anything conscious if we like. So would they ever be conscious? When you want to make them conscious, they will be. Like Westworld, I don't know if you watch that series or it's a simulation. And then, is that simulation real? How would I ever know I am not yet another simulation? But I would always say I have this originality. But every simulation would have the same claim. And then we will enter into a quagmire of which I have no escape. And then we can learn together on that one. Thank you so much.
Bom, a pergunta do Lucas, ele fez bastante rápido, eu perdi algumas coisinhas outras, mas ele comentou, em princípio, que nós, da LAF, né, da Associação Intercultural de Filosofia, não, Associação de Filosofia Intercultural Latino-Americana. Né?
Associação Latino-Americana de Filosofia.
Ok, isso. Nós organizamos com a Universidade de Passo Fundo uma especialização em filosofia intercultural e nós adoraríamos tê-lo como nosso professor convidado para palestrar. E eu teria tantas questões a respeito das discussões mais técnicas e conceituais que você apresentou, mas se eu pudesse fazer uma pergunta, eu vejo que no modo como você o expôs, eu posso entender que você entende a causalidade de tal modo que a consciência fundamental ela está sempre se manifestando. Aí, de outro modo, essa parte eu não consegui pegar. Mas, você lembra? É que a consciência base está sempre se manifestando.
É uma questão de causalidade, porque pela exposição que ele fez de causalidade, me pareceu justamente que não faz sentido dizer que tem algum momento em que isso começa a acontecer, senão você teria que perguntar o que leva isso a acontecer.
Uhum.
Então você tem que pensar que a consciência base está sempre se manifestando.
Isso. Né? E ele pergunta em seguida, há alguma conexão entre o problema da consciência que você apresentou e o debate atual sobre a inteligência artificial? Em que medida a inteligência artificial é consciente ou não? No que ela está fazendo, ela está manifestando inteligência e cognição ou não? E um comentário final, é realmente fascinante o modo como você apresentou essa perspectiva, a única palavra sânscrita que eu entendi, upaya, né, que é o meio, o método. Então, o modo como você descreveu essa perspectiva é como se o discurso filosófico pudesse ser um meio para vir a ter um modo de experiência. Que pode se conectar com uma outra forma de ler, mesmo a filosofia ocidental. Como, por exemplo, quando Adô argumenta que na filosofia antiga, a filosofia não era apenas para desenvolver, articular teorias, né, mas também exercícios espirituais que serviam também para contribuir, dentre outras coisas, para a consciência cósmica, o reconhecimento do nosso verdadeiro eu como não apenas sendo individual. Então, o discurso filosófico era o paia nesse sentido. Ele era adaptável, não era uma teoria absoluta de todas as coisas. E quanto à resposta, ele diz que ele talvez não tenha tempo de tratar de todas as questões que ele trouxe, mas que ele acredita em Vimarsha, e Vimarsha é ter uma conversa. E uma conversa não precisa ter um propósito, ela não precisa levar a alguma outra coisa. O problema fundamental da sociedade é a gente não ter boas conversas. E nós podemos ter uma conversa saudável mesmo quando a gente não responde todas as questões ou trata de todas as questões. Quanto à causalidade, se nós vamos a filósofos como Nagarjuna ou Gaudapada, para eles o conceito de causalidade não faz sentido. Se nós pensamos nas nossas experiências normais, a causalidade é superimposta. Você, por exemplo, pode dizer algumas palavras que eu culturalmente não consigo entender e eu fico com raiva quando eu escuto elas. E aí eu atribuo um senso de causalidade. Porque você disse isso, então eu tenho que ficar com raiva. Mas não há relação causal. Eu estou apenas concedendo um valor, atribuindo um valor. Se você fazer isso, aquilo tem que acontecer. Isso são sinais de valores. Então, nesse sentido, nós podemos voltar à questão da causalidade e questionar ela como um todo. Mas eu não diria que disso se pode, né, concluir que nada jamais ocorreu. Eu não acredito que disso nós podemos deduzir esse nível de vacuidade absoluta. Porque eu não estou nesse momento tentando ser um Buda, eu estou tentando explicar a minha experiência mundana e o desfrute da companhia dos meus amigos e da comida, né, se eles me deixarem comê-la. Então, nesse sentido também, a minha somaticidade é o que importa. E há algo acontecendo, né? Há algo acontecendo. Isso é um efeito completamente aleatório de uma emergência completamente assimétrica. Acho que essa era a questão, né? Então, a Abhivyakti, a emanação, esse senso de manifestação que ele tentou trazer, a ideia de que algum potencial já está lá. Há essas características, esses potenciais, e quando eles emergem, eles não são como entidades diametricalmente opostas, né, a causa e o efeito. Os potenciais já estão lá. Então, o ovo de pavão só pode dar origem ao pavão. De outra forma, tudo pode acontecer de tudo. Qualquer coisa pode acontecer a partir de qualquer coisa. Mas ainda assim, há uma pequena diferença entre causa e efeito. Nós não precisamos insistir em negar essa diferença e chamar isso de Advaita, nem precisamos fazer com que causa e efeito sejam completamente diferentes e chamar isso de Dvaita, né? Então, não dual e dual. E às vezes eu escuto esses grandes filósofos nos departamentos de filosofia e depois eu me arrependo e penso que eu deveria ter ido escutar os físicos e os biólogos, porque os filósofos estão reduzindo o seu departamento como se fosse um mero apêndice à física. E, por outro lado, a física explica todas as coisas, né, que são o seu objeto de estudo sem precisar fazer recurso nenhum aos filósofos. Então, filósofos nos departamentos modernos fizeram si mesmos como o objeto de laughingstock, me ajuda aí. De chacota. E se tornaram redundantes. Então, se nós temos que reinventar todo o escopo da filosofia, nós precisamos voltar, né? Não precisamos necessariamente ir até a China, Laozi, etc. Nós podemos voltar pelo menos à filosofia pré-socrática. Nós não precisamos tentar nos encaixar na multidão dos ditos cientistas e sacrificar todo o coração da filosofia. Nós devemos voltar às nossas raízes ao invés de reduzir o nosso departamento a fim de pertencer, né, um contexto. E quanto à questão da inteligência artificial, eu não tenho nenhuma ideia. O único tipo de consciência que nós conhecemos é a consciência biológica, né, que parece ser uma frase de um autor... do Searle. Uhum. Isso significa que o chat GPT nunca pode ser consciente ou que meu robô não vai entender meus sentimentos. E o fato é que muito do entendimento é superimposto. E ele comenta que ninguém acha que fazer filosofia indiana é fazer filosofia séria, então eu posso fazer piadas livremente. Então ele conta uma história na Índia de pessoas que têm essas bonecas sexuais. No Japão, desculpa, no Japão, isso. E que tem bonecas sexuais. Muito peculiar. Na Índia isso é assim especial. E essas pessoas, o que fazer quando essas bonecas estragam, né? Porque você não pode simplesmente descartá-las, você esteve ali com elas ao longo de 15 anos, elas se tornaram queridas para você em algum sentido, então, se elas estragam, o que você faz? Você vai precisar também de um sacerdote para um ritual de enterro, né, das suas bonecas sexuais? Então, nós somos criaturas fantásticas, nós podemos tornar qualquer coisa consciente se a gente quiser. Serão elas, em algum momento, conscientes? Elas serão se a gente quiser que elas sejam, porque é uma simulação. E se essa simulação for real, e como eu posso saber que eu não sou também uma simulação? né? Até se eu disser que eu tenho originalidade, né, alguém pode dizer na simulação também pode ter isso, né, também pode reivindicar isso. Então, nós entramos num caminho numa rua sem saída.
Yeah.
Uma última pergunta.
Yeah.
Thanks for the lecture. It was excellent. Okay.
Thank you.
A few years ago, there was this new paradigm in cognitive science that was called post-cognitivism, and it was marked by two theories, embodied cognition and enactivism, that says that cognition arises through some kind of dynamic interaction between an active organism and its environment. So perception is more like something we do than something we can represent for ourselves, thereby rejecting representationalism. And the first wave of authors that market this paradigm, like Humberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, Eleanor Roche, and et al., they try to start a dialogue within Eastern philosophy, and the paradigm of the dialogue within enactivism was Buddhist, especially the Madhyamaka one. That they thought that interdependent origination and something like this at first glance looks like something that remembers enactivism in some sides, I don't know. But the fact is, within time, this approximation came to oblivion, and it did not go forward. So my question is, do you believe that this dialogue would be more productive if it would be with Tantra and Hindu, or if it can be made? Do you think that what examples of applications can we think between Tantra and enactivism, embodied cognition, and so on?
One of the philosophers within this tribe that I have closely interacted with is Evan Thompson, and his embodied mind, and also the work he has, Waking, Dreaming, Being, one of the books, I think came out around 15. I can clearly see, I would not say inactivism completely died or became irrelevant, because there are some good philosophers and good writings still happening. But the radius within which it was meant to work was very limited. I would agree with you. And you can see the way Thompson begins his own book in Waking Dreaming. He has to go to the Upanishads to start the conversation on the state consciousness. So we, number one, we are scientifically minded, and we are already doing cross-cultural philosophy, but sometimes we get dogmatically close to one particular school of thought or one particular philosopher, and then we should open, not that therefore if we address Hindu philosophy it will be better. We should engage all the possible models out there. And the very notion of activism only in the sense of dependent origination, out of what? If it is an emergent property that did not exist before, it arises or manifests as if arising dependent upon environment and all the circumstances, it will not ever be able to address the core problems of consciousness. Again, we are going to the same type of physical reductionism with the fancy term of inactivism. But if inactivism is a mechanism that allows the intrinsic tropes to manifest, then I would say the abhivyakti, the manifestation model that I'm discussing, will give a much wider literature to address with, from the Ayurveda text, the early like 3rd century, 2nd century texts that are already using this model to discuss even the causality, even the Puranic text I'm bringing to you, and the Tantric text I'm bringing to you, the language, how the meaning arises from Bhartrihari, so it's like we could open to wide array of literature to discuss that. And one good thing I like is consistently they trace examples, like very much biological examples, and that is the part I like, because the type of experience or consciousness I am familiar with is pretty much biological, and that is where I find that if their example is pretty much biological, I could relate to that, I could map with my own phenomenal experience, and yes, I agree with you that we should continue exploring new models, and these philosophies should not be kept aloof. One of the things I have experienced is like when I did my PhD in Germany, and the first time I wrote an application letter for a job, my friends, my good American friends said, don't apply to any philosophy department. Who is going to read your application letter? Apply to religious studies. And it was kind of painful thing for me to accept, but since I had to leave home and I needed a job, so that is how I compromised. But my point is, I'm not critiquing on what or what. The whole West sees that the non-West is a faith group of irrational bunch. They cannot have a rational philosophical conversation. For that, you need to have this enlightenment that is only limited to Europe. Not South America, not even in Europe, not like Italy or Spain or something like that. It is maybe up to France. You can go. That's allowed. Germany is kind of maybe they're weird. So we have the need not just to break the barrier of the West and the non-West. There's so many ideas we are repressing, honestly, and it's simply exploiting the same type of analytical philosophy as the 75% of the department, and then maybe continental a little bit, and that's it. So more ideas should be allowed to come, and I congratulate you. I was not aware of such programs, and I would love to be part of those adventures. Because what's my life worth? My friend up there said that your journey looks like the opposite. I have a bunch of friends like that. Why am I taking all these trends to learn cognitive science or learn phenomenology? Because the day I accepted to learn English language, my fate was sealed. I still write in Sanskrit. I love to write in Sanskrit, actually, and I feel that I express myself more closely if I'm composing in Sanskrit. And everything I'm doing is simply translating my experience, even when I'm speaking in English. Therefore, that's already one translation from one language to the next. And scientific language or cognitive philosophy language is just another language to translate those same ideas for the new audience. So all I'm trying to do is have a vimarsha, have a conversation. That's all. Thank you so much.
Ok. A pergunta foi bem rápida também, talvez eu tenha perdido alguma coisa, mas alguns anos atrás havia um novo paradigma na ciência cognitiva chamado pós-cognitivismo. E ali duas teorias estavam presentes, da cognição encarnada, ou incorporada, corporificada, e o enactivismo, que dizem que a cognição emerge através da cognição da interação dinâmica entre o organismo ativo e o seu meio ambiente, como se a percepção fosse algo que nós fizéssemos. Aí eu perdi algumas coisinhas e eles tentaram começar um diálogo. Então é um modelo que rejeita o representacionalismo. E então eles começaram a tentar um diálogo, e o paradigma um diálogo intercultural, e o paradigma desse diálogo dentro do enactivismo era o budismo madhyamaka. E eles pensaram que ali a teoria, né, do madhyamaka de originação dependente, na primeira vista, parecia algo como o enactivismo. Mas o fato é que, com o tempo, essa aproximação foi esquecida e não foi adiante. Você acredita que esse diálogo poderia ser mais produtivo se feito com o Tantra hindu? E se ele pode ser feito, que exemplos de aplicação nós podemos pensar entre Tantra, inactivismo, consciência corporificada e assim por diante? E a resposta: um dos filósofos com os quais eu interagi de muito perto é Thompson. Evan Thompson. Ele tem uns livros sobre mente corporificada, a esperança, despertar e ser. E eu poderia ver claramente que eu não diria que o inativismo morreu e se tornou irrelevante. Alguns bons filósofos e escritas ainda estão acontecendo, mas o raio em que isso se supunha que ia atuar acabou sendo bastante limitado. O modo como o Thompson começa o livro dele, ele vai para as Upanishads para discutir a ideia de estado de consciência e tal. Aí, eu não sei se eu perdi alguma coisa aqui, mas ele diz, né, nós pensamos muito de forma científica e estamos fazendo filosofia intercultural, mas algumas vezes nós nos tornamos mais próximos de algum pensamento ou filosofia em particular. Mas nós deveríamos engajar todos os possíveis modelos disponíveis. A própria noção de inactivismo, apenas no sentido de originação dependente, a partir do que? Se não é uma propriedade que não existia antes de emergir... Se não é uma propriedade, aquilo não existia antes de emergir. E, bom, aqui ele estava meio que questionando a originação dependente, mas eu não peguei todo o argumento. O que leva esse nativismo de volta a um mero fisicalismo sobre um outro nome. Mas se o inativismo adotasse um modelo que permite tropes, como é que eles falam isso em português mesmo? Tropes. Né? Então, então se fosse um modelo que permitisse que os tropos intrínsecos se manifestassem, isso permitiria uma perspectiva muito mais abrangente fosse tratada. Então, quer dizer, né, que é a perspectiva que ele estava lendo, se nós lêssemos o inativismo a partir dessa perspectiva. E daí nós poderíamos voltar até os textos de Ayurveda, que já lá no século III estavam aplicando este modelo, e textos purânicos e textos tântricos. O filósofo Bhartrihari, o modo como ele discute, como o sentido emerge na linguagem. Então isso abriria uma gama muito ampla de literatura para discutir isso. E eu gosto que essa literatura está constantemente utilizando... Agora eu não sei se ele está falando a verdade dessa literatura indiana ou do inativismo, mas eu gosto que eles estão constantemente usando exemplos biológicos, porque o único tipo de experiência consciente com a qual estou familiarizado é biológica. É o inativismo, né? E se seu exemplo é biológico, eu posso relacionar com aquilo e mapear minha própria experiência naquilo. Então, eu concordo que nós deveríamos continuar explorando novos modelos e essas filosofias não devem ser mantidas à margem. Então, uma das coisas que eu experienciei quando eu fiz meu doutorado na Alemanha e escrevi minha primeira carta de aplicação por um emprego, meus bons amigos americanos disseram: não aplique para nenhum departamento de filosofia. Quem que vai ler a sua aplicação no departamento de filosofia? Aplique para um departamento de estudos religiosos. E foi doloroso para mim aceitar aquilo, mas uma vez que eu tinha deixado a minha casa e precisava de um emprego, eu tive que aceitar. Então todo o Ocidente vê o não Ocidente como um grupo de fé irracional. Como se eles não pudessem ter uma conversa filosófica racional. Como se para isso você precisasse do iluminismo. Que, no caso, para o iluminismo você precisa da Europa. E nem mesmo a América do Sul está inclusa ali, e nem mesmo toda a Europa, como Itália ou Espanha, né, são alguns países específicos. Então nós precisamos não apenas quebrar a barreira do ocidente e do não ocidente, mas também se dar conta de que há muitas ideias... Então nós precisamos não apenas... acho que eu perdi alguma coisa porque não está fazendo sentido, mas enfim, ele está comentando que nos departamentos hoje em dia só se exploram principalmente filosofia analítica, um pouquinho de filosofia continental e só, mas na verdade há muitas ideias que nós não estamos expressando, que estão sendo reprimidas, então mais ideias deveriam ser permitidas a vir à tona. E ele parabenizou o Lucas pelo movimento de filosofia intercultural aqui, que ele gostaria muito de fazer parte disso. E ele termina dizendo por que eu estou falando de todas essas tendências de ciência cognitiva ou fenomenologia, por que eu comecei a aprender essas coisas, né? E ele diz aqui que o dia que eu aceitei aprender o idioma inglês, o meu destino estava selado. Eu ainda escrevo em sânscrito, eu me expresso mais de perto quando eu estou compondo em sânscrito. Então, nesse sentido, tudo que eu estou fazendo é traduzindo minhas experiências, mesmo quando falando inglês. Ciência cognitiva, etc., é apenas uma nova linguagem para me dirigir a novas audiências e tudo que eu estou tentando fazer é ter uma conversa.
Thank you. I was just not sure when it's going to stop. It's called liberation. So if you guys, so you're done, you know. So I am sincerely thankful to you, really, again, because who sits to listen to philosophical conversation anymore? It's just like non-productive, you know. People are very wise these days. They do productive things, and by productive they mean to make money, you know. But anyway, it's so enlightening to see that in the heart of Brazil there is love for doing philosophy. And not just love for doing philosophy, there is love for doing alternative philosophy, to think beyond the mainstream analytical philosophy. And to have this audience means a lot to me. I'm bringing home my experience of your love and your company. And I deeply appreciate professors coming and engaging and giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. And I seek to engage and keep this conversation alive, and I hope to see you maybe one time in mainland also. Let us see how we can make that possible, and maybe also here too. Thank you so much.
Gente, primeiro de tudo, agradecer muito a presença de vocês. Thank you so much again, Professor. That was so great to have you here with us. We have lots to talk about. Eu só queria fazer então aí uma última propaganda aí, né, da nossa especialização, que as matrículas estão abertas agora. Vão até dia 11 de agosto. No caso, é uma parceria da ALAF com a Universidade de Passo Fundo. É uma pós, né, uma pós lato sensu completamente EAD, e que a ideia é justamente fornecer um contato com essas outras tradições que a gente geralmente não consegue ter contato na nossa formação de filosofia na graduação e assim por diante. Fornecer esse olhar plural, inclusivo, diverso da filosofia, né, trazendo outras tradições. A gente tem seminários de filosofia indiana, justamente estão inclusos no programa, mas também de filosofia chinesa, latino-americana, africana. Quem tiver interesse, só escrever um e-mail para a gente no alafoficial@gmail.com. Pode também falar com a gente pelo Instagram, né? E, é claro, agradecer também o professor Sacrini, que tornou possível aí, né, essa palestra aqui hoje. Professor Sacrini is our professor here that made it possible for us to be here, so I also want to thank him very much for that. E é isso, gente. Espero que a gente continue essa conversa em outros momentos e vai ser um prazer se a gente puder contar com vocês aí nessa especialização. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, Danilo. Thank you, Guilherme, everyone from the Vimarsha Foundation. See you another time.